Hi, everybody. Welcome. Please find your seat on the train here. We'll be taking off shortly. Couple of cars. There's plenty of seats over there. Find your seat and get strapped in. We want everybody sitting down in your seat on the train by 12:01. And then we're going to take off on time at 12:02. So thank you. Welcome. Hello, everybody. I'm Reese Roth. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Sustainable Infrastructure, and it's my pleasure to welcome everybody. So exciting to see all of you joining us here. And this is the first stop on the CSI Sustainable Infrastructure virtual whistle stop tour of the Pacific Northwest. Times are tough right now for many of our communities with all the economic disruption and the challenges that we're facing. But this tour is about the future and how we can pivot from hardship to a thriving future for all our communities by reimagining our infrastructure investments. So all aboard, we're taking off. That's a train whistle, by the way. And it's this train is pointing toward Raymond. Raymond is a struggling but a resilient timber and seafood town in Southwest Washington that refuses to stagnate and decline. And instead, they're coming together around an innovative industrial symbiosis strategy to revitalize their community. And stepping back a little bit, this whistle stop tour, it's going to visit communities big and small and in between in all parts of the Pacific Northwest, rural, suburban, urban, east side, west side, Oregon, Washington, that like Raymond are jumping out of the rut of old solutions to innovate. And we're going to dig in to the big ideas and the key strategies to solve our critical infrastructure challenges and revitalize local economies and rethink how we spend billions and billions of dollars to operate and maintain and rebuild and expand the infrastructure systems that all of us rely on every day. Water, energy, waste management, transportation. Every community needs quality infrastructure. So at each of our stops on the tour, we'll highlight how one innovative community is translating one of these big ideas to their local context. And this whistle stop, we titled it, When More Industry is Also Pro-Environment, How Industrial Symbiosis Can Multiply Jobs and Benefits for the Environment. And Raymond, I told you that they're coming together around an industrial symbiosis strategy. It's a strategy centered around an energy innovation district at the Port of Willapa. And I'm very excited to introduce the man who's been leading the charge in Raymond. He's someone with deep, deep roots in that community, working for a couple of decades, I think it's fair to say, for Pacific County, very creative, forward-leaning economic development strategies. Please welcome Mr. Jim Sace, who's the director of the Port of Willapa Harbor.
Good morning and welcome to the Center for Sustainable Infrastructure's first whistle stop tour on sustainable infrastructure. And I welcome you to the Port of Willapa Harbor, where I'm the manager. And I'm standing in the heart of what was and is still a bustling woods products industry. Over my left shoulder here is the Weyerhaeuser Mill. And if you go back, say, 100 years, you have there in the distance the old turnstile trestle for the Burlington Northern Railroad, which hauled wood product out that was made here. I'm also standing on the South Fork Industrial Park, and this is the site of the old Olympic Hardwood Mill and then Mayor's Brothers Mill. And there in the distance you can see the old hog fuel burner and bin and the current dry kilns and storage building. This area was a very vibrant area, and we hope to talk a little bit about it more in terms of a modern reimagination known as a energy innovation district. So all aboard, welcome. Thank you, Reese. My name is Jim Sayce, and this first slide shows the core area of the Energy Innovation District. This slide has elements that date back over 100 years. And in the foreground there, you can see the piling that were used to hold the booms of logs. There's an in-feed ramp there that was to an old mill. And that's where they do what's called a water sort. Of course, in the distance, you can see the hog fuel burner to the left and the mill's kilns, 3 of them in a row, and then a modern version of a storage shed. This is my talk is like the arc of sustainability with the thread of symbiosis. Here's a slide of 1930, 90 years ago. And it's important to look at this in the distance because you can see the South Fork Industrial Park, which is right here. If you can see my cursor, and there's the turnstile of the Burlington Northern. Up in the left-hand corner, you can see smoke from 2 hog fuel burners, from 2 wigwam burners that were burning waste wood. If you look really closely, you can see the logs in the rafts there in the South Fork of the Willapa River. And if you look really hard, you can see them in the Willapa River. Next slide. Here's a shot of the site in 1963, quite a few years later. Important thing about this is the age of transportation and how that moved wood, and that transportation system is related to the symbiosis of other businesses. That can be trucking companies, logging companies, they could be tugboats in the water, tugboats that towed logs. Most interesting about this is how the transportation system evolved. There's 3 sidings, there's 4 railroad sidings on here, and before this decade was older, there'd be a 5th. Those railroad sidings went from an original sawmill and then were eventually redone into new access to the current sawmill. Most noticeably, up in the left corner there, you'll see a shadow, and that shadow is of a very tall burner that burned waste sawdust, and you can see the white on the ground. That's all waste sawdust. Next slide. In 1977, this is the era that I was going to Evergreen State College. I drove by here many times. The most dominant feature of this is the waste sawdust. Logs are actually the second dominant feature, but all of that light brown, light tan at the top of the page, over on the left side where the warehouse or mill is located, and over on the right side, which is the South Fork Industrial Park, all of that is sawdust. And even the highway was recently rebuilt in the late 70s. It was built on a massive, I would say many thousands of yard sawdust pile. Next slide. Here's a closer look. What's important about this is you have, back up 1 slide. What's most important about this is you have up in the upper part of the image, you'll see the mill system, and then you'll see a little bit of white smoke coming out of a hog fuel burner. This hog fuel burner was fed by waste sawdust, and the reason the smoke is white is hog fuel and sawdust have moisture in them, and the moisture shows up here not as smoke, but as basically white water vapor. You can see the in-feed decks of the kilns here to the left. There's 2 kilns. A 3rd one would be added within 2 decades. And then you can see where all of the outfeed areas of storage of cut lumber, tremendous. You can see the old dock here, which is not being used anymore. And you can see the logs stacked in rows on wet sawdust. So there was a transition of the use of sawdust, not as a fill product, even though it's still being used here, but in terms of the hog fuel burner used to power the kiln. Next slide. So here's about 20 years ago, and the tremendous change happened in this 20-year period. And Reese says I'm at my 5-minute limit. I just want to show you the change here, and quickly we'll go to the next slide. Here's a close-up. Next slide. And here's the sum of all those. Next slide. And here's the site today. Next slide. Here's the transition, hog fuel burner in the center, wigwam burner on the left, kilns on the right. What we're proposing to do is even more extraordinary with heat. Next slide. We're proposing to create an energy innovation district of about 6 acres inside a larger park of about 40 acres. Within the energy innovation district, we want to focus first on the use of energy from a pellet mill. Next slide. And we used a team of people to get there. And in this slide, you'll notice the system as designed is to create heat. Next slide. Is to capture heat from the pellet mill. And Steve Modemeyer helped design this, go through a heat exchanger system, store it as hot water, and then dole it out to the various parcels and ultimately end up on the next slide. With the system displayed around as an energy innovation district. This is our ultimate goal. And I also included at the bottom of the possibility of a future bioreactor and compost. But basically it takes the heat energy, creates a system to grow algae, a system to grow mushrooms, a system to grow plants, and perhaps a system in the end to include compost and other waste handling. Thank you very much.
Jim, thank you for that hometown tour and very exciting direction that Raymond's headed around this energy innovation district. So why are we starting this whistle stop tour with Raymond and with Industrial Symbiosis? Well, for the last 3 years, each September, 2017, 2018, 2019, CSI has teamed up with a couple great partners, iSustain and the Scan Design Foundation, to bring Washington state legislators and other champions of sustainable infrastructure innovation on study tours of Denmark. And in total now, 26 Washington state legislators have joined us on these week-long tours. And the amazing thing is exactly half of them have been Republicans and half of them have been Democrats. And you might think that could go badly, but lots of bickering, crossed arms, arguments, but we experienced exactly the opposite. These legislators saw in Denmark practical, effective solutions that could be adapted back home to benefit communities of all shapes and sizes in all parts of our state. And spending every day together for a whole intense week in another country created a lot of opportunities for legislators to really learn about each other's districts and what's important to the people living there. And they began to see innovations in Denmark that could help people in lots of different districts, including theirs. So the idea that this bipartisan group of legislators decided to galvanize around and work together on was this very Danish idea of industrial symbiosis that is both pro-jobs and pro-environment. And it can be adapted to benefit all kinds of communities. So they came together to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in tools and research to support this approach in 2018 legislative session and 2019 legislative session, and to pass legislation in 2020, SB 6430, creating and funding the nation's first statewide industrial symbiosis program. And that bill passed with unanimous support through incredibly hard work from people on both sides of the aisle. So it was an amazing victory for them. And then the governor was forced to veto this and all the other funding bills when the COVID crisis suddenly opened up this gaping hole in state revenues. So that was sad, but you can count on this. These folks are determined. They're going to be back in 2021 with a bold new industrial symbiosis push. So I just want to give a special shout out here for our key partners on the Denmark study tours. And without them, all this great progress in Washington would never have been possible. So iSustain has been running tours like this to Scandinavia for over a decade, and they're so good at it. It's just a great experience for everyone involved. And we teamed up with them in 2017 to create a truly bipartisan legislator tour. And I think we surprised ourselves in succeeding in that. And the Scan Design Foundation has provided the scholarships that allowed legislators to come on these tours. And that made it all possible. So thank you. And now I want to hand it off to Mr. Ted Sturdivant. He's CSI's Director of Strategic Initiatives for a panel discussion to dive into industrial symbiosis, which holds such promise for our communities to multiply jobs and environmental benefits together. So Ted.
All right, Reese, thank you. I don't have the whistle or the hat, but I'm going to be the moderator for today's discussion, and let's get right into it. But before we do, what we'll do for the rest of our hour is have a panel discussion with our three superb panelists. And we'll do that for a little while and then start taking some questions from the audience, though it'll look and feel the same. I'll just be paying attention to questions that pop up. So there's a Q&A function on your screen. And if you're interested in a question of the panelist, please enter it there. If you want to chat and participate in the ongoing conversation, then use the chat thread there. And then we're going to carry that through until 12:55, and then I'll give Reese a few minutes to wrap us up, and we'll move on. Okay, so with that, let me introduce our panelists. First, I'm going to go to Steve Modemeyer, who is a principal for Collins Warman in Seattle and CSI's Innovator-in-Chief. Steve specializes in creating tools and alternative strategies that lead to resilient infrastructure systems. He's an expert in water, energy, and urban land use, and led the creation of a global program called Cities for the Future for the International Water Association. Steve is working on a resilient government campus for an American Indian tribe. He's working on renewable district energy projects across North America, and has authored several studies on resilient strategies for disaster mitigation and recovery. And as is suggested by his bio, Steve is a truly integrated thinker and well-rounded human being whose vast expertise and broad perspective make him a really powerful innovator and a powerful part of our team. Per Moller, we're fortunate to have, it's the evening for Per over in Denmark, where Per is a senior symbiosis developer in the Kalundborg Symbiosis in Denmark, which is a public-private association that we'll hear a little more about. Per has a master's in marine biology and a PhD in biochemistry and nutrition. And for the last 10 years and more, Per has facilitated the implementation of industrial symbiosis and green business models for public, private, and knowledge institutions. And as Reese said, starting in 2017, Per introduced us at CSI and Washington policymakers to this concept of industrial symbiosis. And you'll hear more about how that idea is taking root here in the Northwest. And finally, I want to introduce Kathleen Sayce, who was born and raised on the peninsula. Kathleen has a bachelor's in marine ecology, a master's in botany, and doctoral work on lichens, which reflects a lifelong passion for organisms that photosynthesize. Kathleen has made some real important contributions over the years to the ecology of Willapa Bay, from early recognition of how Spartina was showing up in and affecting coastal estuaries, to how harmful algae blooms were showing up on beaches, to the disappearance of the Oregon silver spot butterfly from coastal meadows. And Kathleen was also the first science officer of the nation's first triple bottom line bank, Shorebank Pacific, back in the late 90s. And since then, she's been consulting on ecological projects. She writes several blogs, including one on the Columbia Coast natural history that I'm looking forward to checking out. And she practices what she preaches through low input, high nutrition gardening with an emphasis on native species, and is currently working on 2 books about local plants on the coast. So with that, let's give a virtual round of applause for our panelists. Thank you, panelists. Excited for your wisdom. Okay, so let's get into it. The panel's going to dig into industrial symbiosis. What is it? How does it work? And how can this approach be adapted so it works across the region and even beyond to deliver economic and environmental benefits together? So let me start by posing a broad question to you, Per, and ask you to tell us more about industrial symbiosis. Denmark has pioneered it. So tell us, what are the core principles behind it? How's it working in Denmark? And what does it mean in terms of environmental and economic benefits? And so I will turn it over to you, Per. You're muted at the moment. Take it away.
Thank you. And I hope that you will be able to see my screen in a minute. Or can you see it already now?
Yes.
Yes, good. There's a slight delay. So yes, thank you for having me. And I'm so happy to hear that you have brought it this far. And I'm a bit proud that you actually now have this program up and running, supposedly in 2021. So congratulations. Very shortly, 3 minutes. Yes, I work with industrial symbiosis. And just to give you a very quick picture into what this actually is, it's not new, it's not rocket science, it's not difficult. It takes a few tricks, and it really takes communication and collaboration. So what it is really a way of looking at using nature's clever development and ability to survive. So having two organizations, you say two organisms working together, sharing resources that could not be used within that one company or by that one organisms. So it's really looking at waste at a different angle, saying this is not waste until we have redefined it, tried to redefine it as a resource. So if it's redefined as a resource, it can then go in and become part of a green business model where companies work together to create new value, maybe create business together, or total different new setup. A third party could come in and establish a business. So it's really using these resources in existing or new production. And the fantastic idea around this, the realization around this is it's really sometimes a win-win for both, for more, and it's definitely a win for environmental issues and for the ability to create innovation and to help existing industries to survive, maybe even grow, or maybe even to attract new businesses. So it's really a partnership of companies, social society to work together towards these new solutions. And it can look like this, like for instance, in our region, a small city. And basically what, just to state here, is that companies, public-private, have understood to work together to create value by exchanging these resources into existing or new businesses. And it can look like this: energy, water, and materials are shared. And you can see some of these arrows is actually pointing out away from this partnership. So these value streams can actually be shared by the community as such, not only within the companies. And the creation of value for this specific case is quite remarkable, looking at only 9 companies. So this is where you can see the CO2 savings annually, the socioeconomic savings annually, and the business profit annually, only based on these specific value streams, waste, creating value from that. And this is not a unique case. It's happening more and more in Denmark. Big industry areas or small areas, it's becoming more and more apparent that this is something that has already been going on. We just need to rediscover them, and it's growing, and we also working in the Nordic area and with you guys, hopefully also in the future. I think I spent my time.
Thank you, Per. Great brief intro. Now I want to introduce, well, I introduced Kathleen, but turn to Kathleen Sayce. Kathleen, it's nice to have you. So the opportunities for industrial symbiosis in rural, natural resource-based communities like Raymond and South Bend are going to be unique to each community based on the resources available. And you've been part of this development in Raymond of the Industrial Symbiosis Project. So which what are you excited about and why in terms of possibilities emerging in that process? And, do you have any thoughts about how to make that work in other Northwest resource-based communities as well?
Well, from my own background at Shorebank Pacific, I know that rural forest products communities always have waste energy, and they always have waste wood byproducts that they can use. And I'm very interested in seeing that improve, our use of that improve. I'm not interested in business as usual. I want to see rural communities become energy production centers, and I want rural communities to take a very hard look at their waste streams and see how they can turn those into products, because they're already there in the community. They don't have to haul them in from anywhere or ship them out from anywhere. And so my focus is really on energy use and materials. It sounds very similar to Pear. Pear, I haven't met you in person, but it sounds like we look at the same things. The rules are the same. And the only real advice I have for people in other rural communities is evaluate your energy and materials waste products. Get outside help. Look around outside your community for people who can come in with fresh eyes and help you take a hard look at what your options are.
Thank you, Kathleen. Steve, so Industrial Symbiosis is working in Denmark. It makes common sense and all the sense in the world to maximize value. What do you think are the most important things for decision makers and economic development leaders to do to take this concept and grow it and spread it here so that we can realize the kind of benefits that Pear is seeing in Denmark?
Yeah, thanks, Ted. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully people will see this. Let me know if it's happening.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay. This, I also, by the way, I was just looking at the participant list, and there's a bunch of old friends out there. Not that you're old, but I've known you for a long time, so it's nice to see your names there. And also wanted to shout out to Alexandra Streamer at Enviro Issues, because she had a lot to do with this project coming together. And this slide here shows kind of the conceptual way that we were thinking about how industrial symbiosis works. And the basic point is, if you think of any sort of a process that's going on at a facility, there's inputs that come in, there's the processes that you do and the products that come out, and then there's byproducts. And those byproducts may or may not have any value to you. And so, and what I've noticed is that a lot of communities, for example, we went into Goldendale, Washington, and I was standing there looking over the horizon. I saw a bunch of steam coming out off in the distance. And I was like, oh, what's that? And well, it was a power plant. But the point was, if they're emitting steam, then they're throwing away heat. And that heat could be actually valuable if we could figure out how to use it. So the point is that we're kind of surrounded by inputs that we naturally assume, like electricity or natural gas. We're surrounded by processes that may or may not use those inputs most efficiently, and then we've got these outputs on the byproducts on the right. And the point of mentioning all this is that when we're looking at any sort of single process, we should be looking at, well, what are the inputs and what are the byproducts, and can any of those byproducts become feedstock for something new, or can we replace some of those inputs? And so this is where sorry for how dense this slide is, but there's a pellet mill going into the Energy Innovation District. That pellet mill is going to have 100-degree Fahrenheit waste heat for at least 2 shifts a day, probably year round. So are there uses like growing algae, which needs temperatures in the 86 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, or mushrooms that needs it at 60 degrees? Are there other industries that would benefit from having a lot lower heat costs by using that waste heat to lower their costs? So then that becomes, it might make their business model actually make sense if they don't have to pay as much for heat because we can supply it in the Energy Innovation District at a reduced rate. And likewise, Can that then cascade down to the mushrooms, who again even need a lower heat? So those kinds of ideas are what happens when you start taking on that mindset of thinking about what are the main industries that we have, what are the inputs coming in, what are the byproducts, and could any of those become feedstock for some new industry? And so the Raymond example is very simple compared to what we saw in Kalundborg, but it's a huge opportunity to get started, because Kalundborg didn't start out on one day with everything being hooked up. It's to start somewhere, and then you start building on it. So you can share heat, you can share water, you can share thermal energy, you can share electricity, you can actually share training and employees, and even trucks. If you don't need a truck full time, maybe you can share a truck. So there's lots of opportunities by thinking in this integrated way. And so I guess the message for policymakers would be to start thinking about what are we doing here, and what are the options that we have to maybe take advantage of some of these waste products and turn them into feedstock. There's lots of technological work going on to make that happen kind of in silos. But what tends to be missing is really thinking about it as a whole system and then looking at it in that way. So it's a real opportunity. And if anything, we're surrounded by opportunity. We just have to kind of reframe the way we ask the questions, and we'll start getting these new kinds of answers where industrial symbiosis is really a path forward.
Thank you, all of you. Let me pose this question. So when we talk about industrial symbiosis, we talk about evolving from this paradigm of or to this paradigm of and. And I'm reminded of the quote, I can't remember who it's by at the moment, but where they talk about the tyranny of the or and the genius of the and. So we're talking about sort of the genius of, instead of, and as a former ecology director, I know all too well how often we are in these situations where it seems that environment is pitted against industry and decision makers are asked to make a choice. And here we're talking about, how do we have both of those things and beyond? But, the slides you just showed, Steve, and Per also, what we're talking about is increased complexity, sort of finding solutions in complexity. And that's a hard thing for all of us who have day jobs that aren't about exploring the wonders of complexity. So how can this work for communities and like Raymond, where people like Jim Sayce, so that they don't have to become an expert in subcritical water reactors in order to even figure out that there is this possibility? So does this mean that these options are just available to people that have the money and sophistication to, hire all the right experts? Or is this available to smaller, more distributed communities? I'd be curious, Per, in terms of your observations there, as well as any other thoughts there about what's it look like to make this broadly available so that economic development projects can be advancing sustainability also at scale?
Well, I can start answering this, and you can then supplement me, Steve or Kathleen. The first thing is that you actually need to maybe look into your local community and maybe make a walk of the town, gang up with a few local people that knows the area and maybe have good contacts to these local industries, or have been employed there, that knows what has been going on and what is being produced, and actually just identify what is there that is not being used. And you don't have to be an expert in that. The best thing would be if there's some cases you already know of, but you need to understand that this is not complex in that sense. You just need to know that you have to focus on resource efficiency. We did that in the old days, right? We were using everything from the animals that we were having running around in the back garden or something, because we were forced to. That was the resources we had, so we needed to exploit. and explore all these resources. So having that in mind as you go around and look at your local industry and resources and the way you run your businesses or you use resources in your local area, I mean, you will be able yourself to actually identify a few things. And then, of course, then you need to gang out with somebody that can actually show you cases that could fit into the utilization of these resource streams. And that's, you don't have to be a specialist, you don't need to hire expensive consultants in, because the technology in many cases out there is just ordinary technology providers that actually already have the solutions. I mean, we have a lot of solutions in Denmark on district heating, high temperature or low temperature, for instance, heat pumps. A lot of other countries and also in the US and Canada, I guess, have solutions. So, I mean, if a contact to a technology provider, they will be happy to help you the first steps. And we can definitely help you with showcasing some of the real life ways of solving it within a network. So I think building a network like you're doing now with an industrial symbiosis program, highlighting these solutions that already exist, I think that's the first way to go. Of course, the bigger, more complex technologies, and if you go beyond energy into material reuse, could become more complex.
You know, I wanted to jump in there. One of the changes I think that comes about if we really want to step up to industrial symbiosis is we need to start asking different questions than we typically ask. So if I'm running a pellet mill, the question I'm asking is, what's the least cost, simplest way for me to make a profit making my product? It's not, how do I make sure there's enough excess energy for someone to grow algae or do mushrooms? So my job is constrained by the mission of my entity. And so asking the pellet mill to dream up this idea is asking them to do more than maybe they should have to. On the other hand, when you're like Jim and you have a port with real estate that you're trying to differentiate from all the other real estate in the world, you actually can see that there's an opportunity here for me to differentiate what we're providing. We have an energy innovation district, and we have thermal energy that we're prepared to provide to users that could be like algae or mushrooms or others. So then it kind of becomes what's your job on how big you can think. And then the questions that you start asking aren't, who wants to buy or rent my real estate? The question is, how can I take advantage of the inputs and the byproducts of these processes that are going on, and leverage that to create more value for my community? And that value could be economic, but it could also be training opportunities like it's going to be in Raymond, and it could be environmental, of course. And so I think that that's how you wrestle with the issue of complexity, is we start asking the right questions, and then we start getting different answers than we would normally get. And just getting us to ask the right questions is oftentimes the biggest hurdle. There are definitely hurdles moving forward, but when you start getting some of these potential answers with this new question, then how we move through that is something we're all very comfortable with.
I'm going to pepper in a question from the audience from Troy Vassos, and this has to do with terminology. Is this just a sort of fancy new name for eco-industrial parks, or is it different? How does industrial symbiosis fit into these other terms like eco-industrial parks that we hear about? Is it really the same thing?
I could maybe just make a short comment on that. And from our side, I mean, it's somewhat the same thing. I would still define eco-industrial park as something that has been designed from the beginning. So really a very defined area where you only have industry. And maybe, I mean, you really have maybe planned, or you're trying to plan, and you have other opportunities in actually organizing infrastructure. From where we are, this grew organically over time. So this was not planned. We had industries there already, but they learned over time to build up a culture to collaborate and create that infrastructure. Even though it was placed in a city where you had to fit in, and rules and regulations made it a bit difficult to actually build the infrastructure. So ours is more like an organic approach, and this could be done everywhere, because you have industry everywhere, and that would be a very good way to start, because you then already have resources available. Starting on a green field, starting from scratch, that's expensive. And that's what the Japanese or the Chinese are trying to do, and others. But I think that's maybe not the most environmental friendly way. We should use what we already have and just use our bright ideas and communicate, create networks, have facilitators to actually support this, and then go and dig into what we have and find good ideas and solve this together to create this resilience in a local area. That could be small cities or big.
That's a good answer. Could you know, the idea that it's an organic process that starts where you are rather than something that's pre-planned allows you to be way more nimble and appropriate.
And I'd just like to state that industrial symbiosis should not be taken as a big ecosystem. You could do it like one-to-one. Two businesses could do excellent business development together, sharing resources. But it could grow into a more complex ecosystem where you get balanced in many more streams and become much more efficient. But you shouldn't allow run away because you don't have a big number of industries to actually do this. You can definitely create value at multiple levels by this approach.
So speaking of that, Per, or other panelists, and this gets to a question from Greg Hayward in the audience as well, which is, so in a greenfield approach, you could sort of optimize where people are located to optimize the flow of resources between them. Do you have experience in or thoughts on how able existing business parks or business areas or clusters that are not in a symbiotic relationship can enter into that? Or so can you do this effectively and reasonably cost effectively without taking a greenfield approach?
It is expensive to retrofit an existing production. So the best thing is to actually identify these opportunities, and then when you have to optimize your production site, renovate it or build new, then you think this into, so maybe you sometimes have to put a good idea to the side and wait 3 years until you really have to do the investment. It is possible. That's also expensive, but I think it's also expensive to actually design the big thing, and you will probably never get there. So I mean, the bigger and more complex the production you have, if it's pharmaceutical, there are other issues that you need to face, and it makes it quite difficult to actually include that, especially if you go away from energy and water and into materials and water that is in contact with the product. Then you have FDA running after you. Yeah. So yeah, it's not a one size fits all. It's from case to case, and that's what makes it so interesting, that you need to know if and find those who know your local area, your local businesses, and then you need to meet up, create a network, communicate, discuss, and get all excited about all the good ideas you will see and all the potentials that are there, and go step by step as a kind of a local effort.
Yeah. Just briefly, Ted, the way I think about it is that every entity, whether they're governmental entity or a business, makes investments, operations and maintenance investments of their existing facilities. And they also maybe take on new product lines, or they think about expanding their facilities. When they're doing that, if the question they ask themselves is, what's the least cost way for me to expand my facilities? That's not the ideal question, but if we've already got people thinking, what's the least cost way for me to expand my facilities and be part of this bigger thing that I'm already part of, which would be the industrial symbiosis district or the energy innovation district, that's when we can then start redirecting. There's a project we're working on in Seattle where this entity, who will remain nameless, could have gone down one road and they would have saved a couple $1 million, but they thought that was too sketchy. So they'd spent $3 million in the old way, and they locked themselves in for another 20 years. So people can make that choice, but they at least need to know that that's a choice. And if a third of the time people make the other choice that is more of an integrated approach, we're going to have huge amounts of innovation, and it's not with new money. It's money that's already being planned to be spent, but spent in this new way because we're asking a question of the better questions of ourselves about how do we maximize the value beyond just the narrow version.
And I mean, now we need to design products, new products in a sustainable way. So looking at the entire value chain, the same thing is when we do production sites or installation, like this design for disassembly on products, we need to look into design for resource optimization when we do our businesses or our production sites and we renovate and build new ones. The best way to actually make value of resources when in technologies are put together.
I want to jump in with just one example for the audience. If they haven't been around this, thinking through the right timing to make an upgrade, I think that's part of the way to frame this. If you use electricity in your building and you can go up a step in the wire size, make the electrical wiring one size larger throughout your building, you're going to automatically improve your energy efficiency by about 10%. But think about when the optimal time to do that is. It is when you're building new or you're doing an extensive remodel. You don't say, oh, we'll do it this year and rip everything open and do it. You wait. You wait until you have the right time. And thinking about how you're pumping stuff around, waste products, water, thinking about how you use energy, and then thinking for the right time helps put a lot of the big pieces in place so that not this year, not next year, but maybe 3 to 5 years from now, you're headed very much in a much more energy and materials use efficiency direction. And that's when you're going to really start to save money and make it easy to come up with new products. Easier.
I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions on the thread here. And also I want to point out an earlier in the chat, Peter Moulton from Commerce pointed out or provided a link to the Commerce report that was funded by the legislature in, I believe, 2019 and led to the bill that Reese talked about earlier this year in 2020. So that's a great thing to check out for folks. Thanks, Peter. So Alexandra Streamer asked about, for an example of where it was, where we reduced a waste stream or maybe converted a waste stream, not just because we were trying to get rid of waste, but because it made sense economically. And Steve, I don't know if Stevenson would provide a good example of that or not, because another question talked about, is there anything like this happening in the brewery district here in Olympia? And I know we've done some work in thinking about that. So can you provide just an example of where this process led to that kind of benefit from a bottom line perspective? And you're on mute, Steve.
There was a reason, because I have no idea. No. Stevenson is a good example. There they have a wastewater treatment plant, and Troy Vassos worked on this project with us. They have a wastewater treatment plant that was being overwhelmed with biological demand, and because they're getting a lot of nutrients that happen to smell like beer when you were at the wastewater treatment plant. In fact, the tank was filled with foam that looked a lot like beer in a big glass, a big 10,000 gallon glass. So when you go back upstream and you say, well, it turns out that, there's normal waste come from brewery stock, but then in this case, one of the key issues was spillage, which is, 3% to 10%, but it's also really loaded with nutrients, and that was going down the drain, and that actually be captured and then reused for pig food, or it could be used in composting. So finding those things that are driving costs downstream at the treatment plant where it was many millions of dollars to upgrade the plant, if we can find those diversions and then use them for other benefits, then we can lower the overall community cost and we can increase the benefits. So that's a little example, but there's another one that comes to mind is right now, when we have a lot of wind or a lot of solar energy and a low demand on the grid, we turn off the windmills and turn off the solar fields. And we could instead be using that energy to preheat hot water all around the region. so then we have lower hot water costs when the time comes for hot water demand. So there's ways that we can take things that we now just shut off and make them into basically pre-supplying resources by using those. That what in this case would be waste wind can create renewable hydrogen, which is another example coming out of Grant County where they're looking at doing that.
How scalable is this? Does this need a certain, size to make it work? Does it have a ceiling? Does it have a floor? Or can this happen, and does it happen at micro scales as well?
Well, Reese asked me to jump in with an example from a fruit drying company that I worked with, and I'd be willing to share that with you if you want.
Please do.
So this is a fruit dryer down, produced dried fruit in the Willamette Valley, still does, bigger, growing his business every year. I met him in the early aughts, let me put it that way. I think it was around 2002. He was up against regulations and fines from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Couldn't expand his business because he had nowhere to take his waste product. His waste product was sugar brine. He dried his fruit by successively putting fruits through stronger and stronger concentrations of sugar brines. And he walked me through his plant, desperate to double the size of the business, nowhere to go that he could find. And I looked at his process and found that he was shipping his brines to Canada to concentrate them when they got too dilute. And then he was shipping them back to the US to use them in his plant. And so these brines were really well traveled. They were going hundreds of miles in every cycle. And he was getting about 5 to 7 use cycles out of a particular batch of brine. And I stopped him on the plant floor and said, this just doesn't make any sense in terms of energy use. I don't care how cheap diesel is right now. I don't care that it's a minor cost in the sense of all your plant operations, but you need to solve this particular problem because you have a material, sugar, that you are not getting enough use out of. We walked through all the options he had on the plant floor that day. He had looked at every one of them, and we didn't come to an agreement about what he should look at next, but I think he went away understanding he had to solve that. And so that was summer that year. And the next winter, I went and toured his plant, and he had solved his problem. He was now treating his brines on site without shipping them away. So he had ducked that energy cost. He was running them through a centrifuge that was chilled to reconstitute them, get the excess water out. He was getting 4 times the use out of the sugar that he had before. So he was going from 5 to 7 uses per batch to 25 to 30 uses per batch. That dropped his sugar cost 80%. He was spending $300,000 a month on sugar before he started doing this. He went to $50,000 a month on sugar. So right there, a couple $1 million a year were saved in this one plant. The other thing he did was he looked around for how to handle brines at the end of their life, because despite the centrifuging and some filtering, they were still eventually going to have picked up off flavors and just could not be used anymore. And what he found was he could filter them heavily through a charcoal filter and concentrate them right there with natural gas to the bricks of Caro syrup, which is I think about 77, pretty, sticky viscous stuff, pump into a tanker, and then it would go right to either an anaerobic digester or an ethanol plant. He didn't have any waste products anymore. He doubled his business within the year because he solved this one brine handling problem. It was thousands of gallons on a monthly basis before that. And afterwards, there wasn't a discharge problem at all. He had solved that problem.
Well, that's a wonderful example, Kathleen, and I cannot believe that we are at our time, because I'm looking at the questions. There are some really rich questions that folks are posing, and we're not going to have time to get to right now. I think what Kathleen just said speaks to one of the real challenges, which is maybe cultural, in terms of folks being open to innovative new possibilities. There was a question about the bill that Reese mentioned. Again, that was Senate Bill 6430. And there was also a question about the availability of capital for investing in projects like this when we find them. And it's a great question and an issue. And part of what we're hoping to do this coming legislative session is accompany the bill Reese talked about in 2021 with request for some capital investment in the capacity to do these projects. So with that, I want to say thank you to Per and Steve and Kathleen for a really rich conversation that I think could go on for a long time. But at this point, I want to wrap it up and turn it over to Reese Roth, who will get us done by 1 o'clock. Reese.
Thank you, Ted. Oh, what a great discussion. Great questions from everybody who's tuning in here. So yeah, I wish we had more time, but thank you so much for joining us for this first stop on the CSI Whistle Stop Tour. And CSI is really growing a network of people like you, of professionals, and the supporters of sustainable infrastructure innovation in the Pacific Northwest. So together, we are going to change the trajectory and help our communities rethink billions of dollars of infrastructure spending to do much better by our communities. So industrial symbiosis is a really exciting idea for doing that. And here are 4 ways that you can help us scale up industrial symbiosis in the Pacific Northwest. 1, look for IS opportunities. Look for industrial symbiosis opportunities in your community, whether you live in a rural, suburban, or urban community, east side, west side. It's a very adaptable idea, and look for opportunities to help lift up disadvantaged people and create opportunity to thrive in these. And if you see potential in your community, talk to us and we can help you think about it. 2, second way you can help us scale industrial symbiosis in the Pacific Northwest. Do you want to see Washington adopt the nation's first industrial symbiosis statewide policy and program? Then, if so, talk to your legislators and get them on board. And if you're in Oregon, talk to your legislators too. There's rumblings and there's interest, and so this could get traction in Oregon as well. 3, bring your colleagues and your friends along for the next stops on the Whistle Stop Tour. So stay tuned. We've got at least 5 more exciting stops in the works that are going to be amazing in really different communities throughout Oregon and Washington. And I think you and your compadres will love it. So invite them, bring them along on the train ride. And finally, CSI is a nonprofit doing, I hope you'll agree, super important work. And like so many others, we've been hit hard by the economic dislocations. And we're working hard to adapt to this strange new operating environment that we're all living in. As you can see, this is a virtual Whistle Stop Tour. So we really rely on support from people like you who really care about this work. So I hope you'll consider supporting us by making a personal donation. I believe there's a link somewhere here that Terry and company are posting, perhaps in the chat room. So look for that link. And if you see your company is at the forefront of sustainable infrastructure innovation, consider joining the inaugural cohort of CSI's new Corporate Innovation Partners Network and help us grow that into a real powerful force to catalyze a thriving future. So with that, thank you so much to Jim, to Steve, Kathleen, Per, and thank you, all of you, for joining us for this first stop on CSI Sustainable Infrastructure Whistle Stop Tour. Here, signing off. Bye now.